Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Hello everyone, and thanks again for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm Dave Percy, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and I'll be hosting today's show. Up first here, the watch warning graphic. We've got winter storm warnings and I think blizzard conditions as well, or blizzard warnings out for the, again, coming back into the picture here, again, Seward Peninsula, eastern Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, inland there across Galena, and north across the Kobuk Valley, much of the Brooks Range, and the western North Slope here, as well as the central Arctic coast, all under the winter storm warning, again, winter storm warning for snow and blowing snow. And then down here, the Yukon Delta, that's a watch. We've got a winter storm watch out for the same conditions, just not quite as sure it'll develop there as it will up here. And then all due to the next storm coming out of the Russian Far East will be spreading snow and a lot of wind into the northwest interior later on tonight and especially tomorrow. On down to the satellite imagery, you can see the system out here, huge area of cloud associated with it. Low center still back in the Russian Far East, back edge of the front, right through here, coming across Adak and Atka. Really not all that strong down here in the southern area, and then just some banding of the clouds out ahead of that into Bristol Bay. Still some sunshine there, clearing skies. And back to the west, also breaking up behind the front, not too bad. Lighter winds and some clearing as well. You can see that low center here that came southeastward, or I'm sorry, southeastward yesterday on Sunday and brought all the snow to like southern Cook Inlet there, Iliamna getting about 15 inches or more, kind of came to a halt and then started sliding southward slowly today. And so as a result, that's kind of causing this front to pivot northward and coming up from the south, spreading again, the heaviest amounts of precipitation occurring over the central and northern areas with less down to the south. And this coming back to the west, but just barely clipping the east side of Kodiak Island there, more or less in the fair swath here from south central Alaska back down towards Shelikof Strait. And clear and cold up over the interior, especially the northeast interior. Temperatures well below zero, even into the afternoon hours. On the chart, here's roughly the position of that front coming up into the Gulf of Alaska and spreading moisture, mostly in the form of snow over the northern areas, and then more of a mixed condition down to the south, again, depending on your elevation. And then up to the north, though, fair skies and cold temperatures, Arctic high, centered near Old Crow there, about 1,036 millibars, light winds there. Pick up a few more clouds, a little bit more in the way of cloudiness along the Arctic coast, but a few skiffs of flurries, really not much at all there, just to knock the visibilities down a little bit, but even that wasn't all that bad. And then the front here, pushing eastward there into the central Aleutians, just coming into the Pribilof Islands, a little bit of precipitation there. Main low center way back to the west there. And then the gradient starting out in advance of the front is still not really affecting the northwest coastal areas of the Bering Strait yet, but that'll change tonight. As you can see, that low center tracks eastward there, comes down about 969 millibars, quite a gradient out in advance of that. Southeast winds 40 to 60 miles per hour out ahead of that, and so snow and blowing snow, creating the near blizzard conditions here as it edges its way eastward. And then just to the east, though, it'll be dramatically improved here with high pressure, keeping it dry and cold over the northeast interior once again. May start to pick up a little bit of an easterly breeze or southeast breeze there along the eastern side of the Alaska Range, around Delta and those areas. Doesn't look like it'll be all that strong, pretty wind-free here across the southwest Cook Inlet into Bristol Bay, and winds coming down for Kodiak Island now, and still a lot of moisture here in the Gulf of Alaska, remnants of this trough and that frontal boundary, but weakening considerably. Call a chance of rain on the south coast, chance of snow or flurries up in the north there, and some pretty good, actually gale force northerly winds continue to blow through Lynn Canal, channeled areas over toward Yakutat, and to a lesser extent, say, through the Copper River Delta. Really not much of that at all going on in Prince William Sound tonight. Moving on to the forecast for Tuesday. Very slowly, the storm exiting the Russian Far East there, just coming off the coast tomorrow afternoon. But the front driving eastward right into the northeast interior. Snow and blow all along this area, and more of a lighter, or it'll be snow ahead of the warm front, but there won't be that much wind with it. So just looking at some snow down in the Kuskokwim Valley, that advancing eastward to at least the Alaska Range, probably by midday, and some of that could actually slip on in to northern Cook Inlet by Tuesday evening. Otherwise, look for the clouds to increase here, but fair weather hanging on to the eastern interior. Less moisture over the Panhandle, still mostly cloudy, but more of a scattered shower condition going on there for tomorrow afternoon. And high pressure here over the Bering Sea, holding this front up to the north there and keeping it mostly directed eastward. And then some warm front action going on just south of the western Aleutians. And for Wednesday, this system kicks off to the northeast there, or slides off, weakens, but still a pretty good shot of snow coming into the western Brooks Range, North Slope areas. That'll actually slip on into the upper Yukon Valley, on out to the Arctic coast. Another storm system pushes up to just south of St. Lawrence Island. Pretty active front, so wind, snow, possibly blowing snow will return to St. Lawrence Island, back down along the Yukon Delta, and rain along the Alaska Peninsula, on down to along the front there as it pushes past the central Aleutians, so it looks pretty wet and windy for the Fox Islands, but improving, definitely much drier out to the west. And the southeast coast system coming northward, warmer temperatures, so that'll be spreading rain northward here. Starting out some kind of a mixed condition over the northern areas, especially over toward the border, but generally the trend will be for warming. And looking at the low temperatures forecast for tonight, quite cold up over the upper Yukon Valley, 35 to 40 below there over the flats, to about minus 30, give or take there for Eagle, and also down toward Token Northway, near or a little below 30 below, otherwise maybe falling to minus 20 at Gulkana, and teens, northern Panhandle, mid-30s south, south central Alaska single numbers, give or take below zero, Kuskokwim Valley, northward to the Kobuk Valley, as well as the central Arctic coast, but then milder here, 20s, as you get into the increasing wind and cloud cover there for the Seward Peninsula to St. Lawrence Island, 30s in the forecast for the Aleutians, and actually on Alaska, looking at a forecast low tonight of 41 degrees. And then for the highs on Tuesday, mid-40s there for the, actually just about all the Aleutians will be in the mid-40s to near 40 for the Pribilofs, and then we've got mid-30s or so for the southwest coast. Inland though, in the 20s, and lower 30s though, back up toward the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island area, with actually low 30s working their way all the way up to Point Hope. Otherwise, staying below zero over the eastern interior areas, with highs in the teens. South central Alaska, greater Anchorage area on down to Kenai, with the southeast coast here, Juneau, Haines, Skagway, upper 20s to near 40 down to the south. And then moving on to the lows for Wednesday morning, shaping up like this again, the coldest in the east, mildest back here to the west where the storminess is. 20 to 25 below now, with cloud cover kind of spreading in over the upper Yukon Valley there slowly, and then but still down into the 25 to 30 degree below range there for Northway and Tok, 10 to 15 below for eastern Copper River Basin. Single numbers of teens now, probably more teens than single numbers for south central Alaska, and 20s, maybe some teens for the Panhandle, but maybe also some mid-30s down to the south. Not much change out west there, staying for the lows, well, in the lower 40s in the central Aleutians. And then moving on for the highs on Wednesday afternoon, just a shade below zero here in the eastern interior, so a little bit of a warming trend going on, more pronounced one coming into the interior here, with temperatures rising into the lower 30s out to the west coast, and near 50 over the central Aleutians, the southeast coast, not much change.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
moving on to flying weather. With that front coming in, we've got IFR spreading up to the coast this evening and then inland throughout the night tonight, across the Yukon Delta and to a certain extent into the Kuskokwim Delta. Front really weakening now down here over the southern areas, but still strong enough to produce an area of IFR here across the peninsula. And looks like IFR extending all the way up to just about Cape Lisburne. Marginal VFR becomes VFR out here, and then some more marginal farther to the west. A narrow band of IFR well off the coast here in the Gulf of Alaska. But we've got IFR covering much of the southeast coast early Tuesday morning, and quite an improvement by the afternoon there. It just vanishes, and it goes to VFR from Dixon Entrance all the way up into Canada. Marginal stuff hanging around the Yakutat area, otherwise VFR eastern interior, and that moisture sliding eastward here. Looks like IFR will develop, or move eastward and develop along the Alaska Range, and then become a little more widespread where the front is stronger up here to the northwest, and then VFR onto the southwest coast. Marginal VFR in areas here for the Alaska Peninsula Aleutians. IFR reappearing down here over the far western Aleutians west of Adak. And then that spreads northward and eastward here. So IFR right across Adak and Atka, northward, not quite to the Pribilofs yet, and marginal VFR for the Fox Islands. Some areas of IFR west and north of the Alaska Range, which puts it right in the greater Fairbanks area for Wednesday morning. Another batch here on the southern slopes of the Western Brooks Range on out to the Arctic coast, and deteriorating conditions now showing up mostly around Prince of Wales Island. And then for Wednesday afternoon, marginal VFR there from Dixon Entrance northward. Not quite to Juneau, but Juneau may be the cutoff point there with VFR back toward Yakutat and of course up to Skagway and all across south central Alaska. The Alaska Range here kind of being the dividing area north of the mountains. Areas of IFR, especially back here to the northwest, and more widespread IFR here sliding in, covering a big portion of the southwest interior, on down along the Alaska Peninsula, then improving to the west. Passes Anaktuvuk, VFR becoming IFR, possibly late in the afternoon. Aitken, just far enough to east, I'll go VFR becoming marginal. And then for Lake Clark and Merrill, just look for a downward trend in conditions tomorrow. Visibility ceilings going IFR in the afternoon, starting out VFR. Same trend for rainy. Windy, not quite as bad. Same trend though, but just becoming marginal. But Isabel, Mentasta, and let's see, Tonita and Portage will all be VFR for another day. And then Chilkoot and White, where today it started out IFR going VFR. Tomorrow will be VFR and transition into more of an IFR condition later in the day. Freezing levels 2,000 feet here right across Sitka on down into Dixon Entrance at the surface there over the northern panhandle, right along the coast again, hugging Kodiak Island and back up the coast there to Nunivak Island. This area really suppressed from what it was yesterday, or actually this morning for tomorrow morning here, 2,000 feet now back south of the Pribilofs. Quite a gradient now right along the Aleutians there, and then it takes a dive to the south. Looking at the icing threat, least threat of icing will be down here to the south. Just some areas of light rime icing possible here. This portion of the front really beginning to weaken, especially moisture-wise, but areas of back to the northwest, 3,000 to 4,000 feet, a little lower up here to the northwest. And I don't think, though, there could be some isolated moderate rime, but it shouldn't be anything too widespread with this system. And then maybe some mixed icing, a chance of there above 4,000 feet for the northern panhandle. And for the jet stream, cold upper low there just west of Banks Island, and northwest sort of a jet there at about 50 knots showing up here, western Arctic coast down to about near Eagle. The stronger jet, though, here coming across the Bering Sea, northern Bering, about 150 knots, and takes a dive to the south here, following, again, what we saw in the freezing levels, 140 knots across the Alaska Peninsula. 3,000-foot winds, really strong. That system coming eastward there into the Chukchi Sea. 50 to 70 knots here coming across the northern Bering Sea. Southwest 25 to 30, increasing throughout the day over the northern interior, and pretty strong winds here across the Bering out of the west, 40 to 60 knots, diminishing a little bit there, 30 to 40 over the Aleutians. Really light winds south central Alaska. Much the same pattern at 3,000 feet here. And moving on to turbulence, we've got a moderate chop on
A generation ago, America's air transportation system symbolized our national ideal of a bold, progressive country on the move. But as times change, so do society's priorities. Today, as commercial property values soar and residential development around airports burgeons, airplane noise has become a point of contention between the aviation community and the neighborhoods that now surround our airports. For some time now, public airports have been closing at the alarming rate of one each week. But it isn't just airports we're losing. Just as the noisy Boeing 707s, 727s, and Douglas DC-8s are disappearing from the nation's skies today, some communities are implementing operational restrictions so stringent that any airplane larger than a Cessna 152 or Piper Tomahawk may have trouble meeting them. Could our light general aviation airplanes become as obsolete as the first generation of jet airliners?
Hi, I'm Phil Boyer, president of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. I know that we pilots are often surprised when the light airplanes we fly generate noise complaints or flight restrictions.
After all, the average residential neighborhood is filled with noises that are louder, longer in duration, and more frequent than overflying airplanes. Most people don't know that the actual ground level volume of a light airplane on climb-out is comparable to the ambient noise of a busy professional office. And it's significantly less than the noise from an interstate highway a quarter-mile away. In fact, as you can see, the typical noise level of a general aviation aircraft, when compared to most other noises in our lives, isn't that dramatic. You'd almost think that light airplanes would fade into the background, but they don't.
You see, scientific studies have shown that people perceive noise as being much louder and more pervasive than it really is. So any passing airplane is imagined to be a window-rattling intrusion into our domestic tranquility.
Whether people's perceptions of aircraft noise are accurate or not, more and more communities are taking steps to monitor and enforce noise reduction measures. In some locations, an array of sophisticated noise sensors tracks and reports airplanes creating noise in excess of local mandates. And in some communities, the benefits of access to the national air transportation system have been lost entirely when airports have been shut down.
In the next few minutes, we'll do two things. First, we'll examine the characteristics that make aircraft noise objectionable to people on the ground. And second, we'll explore some simple pilot techniques that will reduce our noise footprint considerably. But let's make one thing clear at the outset. The pilot's first responsibility is the safety of his passengers and people on the ground. We must make sure that any noise reduction procedure we use is safe and practical, given our personal capabilities and those of the airplane under prevailing conditions. Now, let's take a closer look at noise. The principal source of aircraft noise is the propeller, particularly on high-performance airplanes with constant speed props. The propeller tips at takeoff approach the speed of sound, and that creates a lot of noise. It follows that operating the engine at the slowest RPM, consistent with safety, will create the least amount of noise. A reduction of as little as 200 RPM can reduce by half the perceived noise from a typical high-performance single.
The second most important factor in aircraft noise is how close the airplane is to the listener. If we double the altitude or the lateral distance between our airplane and people on the ground, we generate only 1/4 the perceived noise as before. As little as 500 feet of additional altitude when we cross the airport boundary can cut our perceived noise in half.
Now, numbers don't tell the whole story, though, because of the perception that noise is louder than it really is. For example, this sound is recorded on this tape at the same level as the following sound. Now, which one would we more likely think as noise? Well, one characteristic of sound becomes obvious. A harsh or unpleasant sound seems louder than a pleasant one. An airplane passing overhead may seem loud because, hard as it may be for us pilots to believe, many people perceive the sound as harsh.
Another characteristic, in the same way that flashing lights attract more attention than steady lights, a dramatic change in the pitch or volume of a sound attracts attention. It should be obvious then that abrupt power or RPM changes will attract attention. Finally, noise is relative. Any sound in a normally quiet area will seem louder than it would in a noisy environment.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Today's sea ice analysis done today, Monday. Still showing expanding out here north of the Central Coast, filling in pretty well from, say, where it was on Friday. And also back out here to the western Wrangell Island to the north and along the western coast, too. A definite increase over the weekend. Not so obvious down here to the south. And with the kind of these switching wind directions that we have coming up with storms rolling through, that's not conducive to produce any widespread ice growth here, especially south of the Bering Strait for the next 4 or 5 days. Moving on to the marine forecast, we've got east winds 25 knots, except right through here in this portion of the coastline, 20 knots, but sea still 11 to 12 feet. Small craft advisories down to 30 knots, though, for northern Lynn Canal tomorrow. 25 knots out of the north for Stevens Passage, northeast 25, Clarence Strait. And those drop off to about 20 knots the following day, while Stevens Passage north 25, 30 knots with gusts 45 knots now for northern Lynn Canal. East 25 for much of the coastline, except down to the south. See it swing around to the southeast, kick up to about 25 knots. Prince William Sound, light winds out of the north tomorrow at 10 to 15 knot, or I'm sorry, 15 to 20 knot northeast winds to the North Gulf Coast, and northwest 20 for the Barren Islands, west 20 Kachemak Bay, 10 to 15 knot winds for Cook Inlet. And then for Wednesday, light northerlies for Cook Inlet, but 30 knots out of the northwest here for the for Kachemak Bay and the Barren Islands and the western North Gulf Coast, eastern coast here north at 30, and 25 knot winds, an increase there for Prince William Sound, seas at about 4 feet. Kodiak Island, west to north here, 20 knots with 4 to 10 foot seas, northwest 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay, with seas running at about anywhere from 9 to 12 feet. And then for Wednesday, big increase, gales here, high-end gales for the Bering Sea side of the peninsula, 45 knots out of the south, seas building to 14 feet, 30 knot winds here, Sitka, Castle Cape and Bristol Bay, northerlies, or I'm sorry, northwest, 35 knots there on the east side of Kodiak Island. And for the western Aleutians tomorrow, southeast 25 to 30, and then falling back to about 15 to 25 or 15 to 20 here for the central Aleutians. No small craft advisories except for the 8 foot seas, and north 30, strongest across Unalaska Island with 8 to 11 foot sea heights. Big increase the next day. 40 to 45 knots out of the southwest, seas coming up to 15 feet. Central Aleutians, west, 40 knots, seas 14 to 15 feet, and 35 to 40 out of the northwest all the way back to Shimei and Attu. And moving to the southwest coast, gales, south of Nunivak Island, minimum gales out of the northwest, 13-foot seas, west 40 knots, north of Nunivak Island, 45 knots here at St. Lawrence Island, with those seas coming up to 25 feet. West 40 for St. Matthew Island, to 24-foot seas, 30 knots for the Pribilofs. And 45 knot winds pretty prevalent here. Very windy day. A couple of days coming up for the eastern Bering. Pribilof southwest 45, southeast St. Matthew Island. Southerlies here along the coast. Falling back to 40 knots though for St. Lawrence Island. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, brisk wind advisories east 25 to 30 knots, 40-knot gales for the central coast there, seas building to 12 feet, and that extends across the west side, south 45 knots from Cape Thompson to Cape Beaufort, and then Cape Thompson to Wales, southwest at 40. And what we have on Wednesday looks like this: west 40 knots from Wales all the way up to Cape Beaufort, then south 35 on the western coast, and southeast 25 on the central coast with 20 to 25 knot winds east side to demarcation point. And for tonight, again, clear and cold over the eastern central interior and down into south central Alaska with coldest temperatures down to maybe 40 below zero over the Yukon Flats. Copper River Basin maybe down to 20 or so. Rain and snow chances continue over the Panhandle, but in a downward mode. Weak front brings some moisture into the eastern Aleutians. Winter storm warnings now pushing back in, making a reappearance St. Lawrence Island. Winter storm watch out for the Yukon Delta coast. And then northward, look for very windy conditions and snow and blowing snow with could see wind gusts 40 to 60 miles per hour. And that'll continue into Wednesday as that advances eastward. So do the winter storm warnings. But you can see significantly better south of that front with high pressure over the southern Bering Sea. And fair and cold over the eastern interior, but you're getting pinched off there as that moisture comes in. A drier day for the Panhandle tomorrow, but that system rolls on up with rain spreading south to north throughout the day. And another storm here rolling up into the northern Bering Sea on Wednesday.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.